We're going to meet the initial candidates set to interview for the Bills head coaching vacancy today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of the Herd Mentality Substack, co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, co-host of the NFL First Read Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Locked On Bills is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. Today's episode is sponsored by Prize Picks. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. Well, folks, welcome in. Let's meet the initial candidates that are set to interview for the Bills head coaching vacancy. Now, let's be reminded that this is the initial list. Surely there are going to be more that are coming, especially coaches that are part of the conference championship games this weekend. Guys like Davis Webb and Clint Kubiak, who are two of my favorite candidates for this job. The Bills can't interview them quite yet. And so keep that in mind as we explore this initial list of candidates that the Bills are interviewing for the head coaching vacancy. So we'll talk about the 6 that are known. We'll talk about the background of each one, what makes them appealing, and then what concerns I think there are about that person being hired to be the next head coach of the Buffalo Bills. So we'll start with a couple of familiar names in this first block in Joe Brady and Brian Daboll. Let's start with Joe Brady, who has already completed his initial interview with the Buffalo Bills. He's 36 years old. He grew up in South Florida, played wide receiver at William and Mary, and he started his NFL coaching career with 2 seasons with the Saints under Sean Payton. He went to LSU for 2019 and was part of that unbelievable national championship team with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. Then he went to the NFL very quickly. He was the Panthers offensive coordinator in 2020 and 2021. Came to the Bills to be their quarterbacks coach 2022 through 2023. Midway through the 2023 season, he was the interim offensive coordinator. He became the permanent offensive coordinator and held the job in 2024 and 2025. So what makes Joe Brady appealing? Well, he's offensive-minded. I'm going to have a bias towards the offensive-minded coaches. I think that this Bills team right now, it would make a lot of sense for that next hire to be offensive-minded. And while I don't think that Joe Brady's going to be widely popular as a candidate amongst Bills Mafia, he is considered a serious candidate in other spots. He's interviewed for 6 of the 10 openings across the league and has a couple of teams where he's getting a second interview, including the Baltimore Ravens. He's also been part of some really big-time success. Of course, that 2019 LSU offense, and then you think about the Bills offense last year in 2024, where Josh Allen's the NFL MVP. Well, the coordinator was Joe Brady, and you've had 2 metrically very outstanding offenses under Joe Brady. And while I think there's frustrations that come with the offense that we've watched, and we'll talk about that here in a moment, I am curious about Joe Brady without Sean McDermott. How much of the frustrations of Joe Brady are Sean McDermott and his voice in Joe Brady's ear kind of pushing the run or pushing some of the on-schedule stuff that became a little bit frustrating? I'm curious to find out. I think his familiarity with the situation in Buffalo is probably appealing. He can kind of pick up the pieces and go while adding his full stamp to what's going on. I don't think it's going to be a huge personnel overhaul, right, with Joe Brady stepping into these shoes. I think Joe Brady's extremely accountable. If you've ever listened to him in a press conference, he takes all the blame when it goes wrong, and he gives all the credit to the players when it goes right. I think there's a humility and an accountability that you will like about Joe Brady. And I really enjoyed the Hard Knocks this past year, like when they showed Joe Brady, I thought he showed a lot of juice. I like the way that he spoke to players. I like the way that he spoke to the staff. You could tell that he's got some backbone to him. And I like the way he talks about Josh Allen, calls him the best player in the world. I want a coach that isn't trying to just make Josh Allen like he's just one of the 53 players on the roster. No, he's special. He's different. And I want a coach that's serious about maximizing Josh Allen and getting him to the Hall of Fame and getting him to the Super Bowl. I feel like Joe Brady would be the type of guy that is willing to elevate Josh, in his own perception and try to bring out the most in what Josh can get done in the NFL. So what are the concerns with Joe Brady? I want to actually start with something that Mitch Morse said on the Shout podcast with Matt Marino. And he was talking about the challenge of being elevated in the same organization. So going from a position coach to a coordinator. He talked about how that's difficult and the relationship is different with the players at that point. Well, to Joe Brady's credit, he's done that. He went from quarterbacks coach to OC, but obviously that's another jump. It's different now going to the head coach, right? A very different jump. And, are those relationships that he has with players too much on a coordinator level and you get worried about it elevating to that head coach piece? Something to think about. I think we can all reflect on the last couple of years of the Bills offense under Joe Brady. And while you acknowledge a lot of the success, it was frustrating, right? I think that's probably true of any offense that you watch, right? If you watch it through the lens of this is my favorite team, you're going to have some frustrations with it. But there's no doubt, like maybe a little bit too run aggressive, the Khalil Shakir stuff, spamming mesh. I didn't always care for some of that. And then there's the wide receiver piece where under Joe Brady, not a single receiver except for Khalil Shakir has come close to meeting expectations. And that includes like Stephon Diggs down the stretch, Gabe Davis, Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel, Josh Palmer. There's like a long list of guys that come here, Elijah Moore. They just come here and it just doesn't happen. And at some point, it's not every receiver that you bring in can't be a meaningful piece. Something's wrong, right? So I do find myself pretty worried about that. And then lastly, does he have the right temperament? Does he have the right temperament for the job? This is a unique assignment. And is Joe Brady that guy that's going to come in and have the right tone and message for this team right now? I don't know. I don't necessarily look at Joe Brady as this like strong presence. But I did like what I saw in Hard Knocks, so we'll see where that goes. But I'm not completely out on the idea of Joe Brady. I think with all these candidates, they're going to have appeal and concerns, and I think we should be open to, both sides of it. So I'm not going to be over the moon about Joe Brady, but I don't think it's necessarily a surefire not going to work guy. All right, we got to talk about Brian Daboll, and I have quite a bit to say about him. We'll do that here next and get into Grant Udinski, who's an up-and-coming coach. We'll talk about them on the other side of it. Folks, be sure to stick with me. What if sports were traded like markets? Now you can put your sports IQ to work in real time with Robinhood Prediction Markets. It's not just you against the house. It's you participating in a live market. You can buy or sell your positions live all game long. Use your sports knowledge in the moments that matter. Robinhood Prediction Markets changes the game. It's people moving on the action. So when momentum shifts, you can move with it. I always knew the game, but never had a dynamic way to apply that knowledge. Now I can take part live in a market powered by people. You're no longer a spectator. Play-by-play, you decide. Trade every play with Robinhood. Now available across the U.S. Download the Robinhood app now to begin. Futures and cleared swaps and trading involves significant risk and is not appropriate for everyone. Event contracts are offered by Robinhood Derivatives, LLC, a registered future commission merchant and swap firm. Folks, the NFL season has been amazing, and there's nothing like being at the game. The crowd, the energy, cheering alongside other fans. Watching the game at home is great, but being in the stadium hits different. The frustrating part has always been getting tickets, waiting in queues, dealing with logins, and watching prices change right at checkout. That's why the Game Time app gives the advantage back to fans. It's the hack for unlocking amazing NFL tickets and experiences in just a few taps. The app is incredibly intuitive. Browsing, comparing, and buying tickets will only take you a few minutes, and you'll love being able to see your exact view from your seat before purchasing, so there's no surprises. And you'll love this. The fees are included up front, so the price you see is exactly what you pay. So take the guesswork out of buying NFL tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today and get back to being there live. All right, let's talk about Brian Daboll. Familiar name, but let's really get into right now him as a candidate for this job. He's 50 years old. He grew up in West Seneca, New York, played high school football at St. Francis High in Hamburg, was a graduate assistant at William & Mary in Michigan State. Then he went to the New England Patriots 2000 through 2006. He was actually a defensive assistant his first 2 years and then was a wide receiver coach for his last 4. Then he goes to the Jets, and he's their quarterback coach for 2 years. Browns offensive coordinator for 2 years. Dolphins offensive coordinator for 1 year. Chiefs offensive coordinator for 1 year. Back to the Patriots as their tight ends coach from 2013 to 2016. He goes to Alabama, and he's their offensive coordinator. Comes to the Bills, and we know about him being the offensive coordinator in Buffalo, and then his stint as the head coach of the Giants. So what's appealing about Brian Daboll? Well, his relationship with Josh Allen. That's what's most appealing to me about Brian Daboll. And it's not just that they have a great connection, right? I think that there's a really good personal relationship between those guys. But I think the professional relationship is really strong as well, where he would be a strong voice for Josh Allen. I think Brian Daboll talks to and has spoken to Josh Allen in ways that nobody else can. And I think there's an immense mutual respect. And Ryan Fitzpatrick had a quote this week on his podcast, Fitz and Wit. And they were talking about the Bills and having a head coaching opening and what type of coach they need. And Ryan Fitzpatrick was pretty firm in what he thought the Bills needed. He talked about the need for the Bills to get a veteran coach, and that specifically they don't need a young coach that's going to be buddies and suck up to Josh Allen. He said they need someone that's going to come in and coach him hard and push him every day. Here's a direct quote. There's another level Josh can get to, especially mentally, but he has to be coached hard. And if you bring in a young guy, I just don't see it happening. And so I think Brian Daboll would be the coach that would come in and really push Josh. And so I think that makes it really appealing. I think he checks this box. And I liked how Josh Allen played under Brian Daboll and how those offensive performances went. Now, there was some frustrating things, mostly with the run game, and that was back in the era of Josh Allen where it was like, oh, imagine Josh Allen with a run game. And I didn't love Brian Daboll's run schemes. Well, maybe that's evolved. Maybe Rob Boris, is a guy that was involved with Aaron Kromer, could stick around and help with that piece. And what's interesting about it is before Buffalo, he was known for run schemes. So maybe, there's a good story to tell of how that could play out. I also love that Brian Daboll gets Buffalo. And I think this is an important layer. I think being the head coach of the Bills is different than any other organization where endearing yourself to the community is huge for your success. And I mean, obviously he knows Western New York. There's no question about it. And I think that's a huge layer to his appeal. I love that he's been a head coach, and certainly it didn't go well, but I think there's a lot of value in the lessons that he's learned and maybe having the opportunity to apply them to a different place. I'm not dismissive of retreads. That's not something that scares me. I really do think that guys deserve second opportunities and opportunities to really apply the lessons they've learned. I love that he's offensive minded. But as I go back to this, we got to find Josh Allen, his Mike Shanahan. So just like the John Elway story that I keep going through, and how eventually he finds Mike Shanahan as the head coach and they win 2 Super Bowls. What's really interesting is there's even more parallels between Josh Allen and Brian Daboll. There's a lot of parallels to what John Elway and Mike Shanahan situation, where Mike Shanahan was John Elway's offensive coordinator from 1985 through 1987. Then he left to go be a head coach with the Raiders, and it went horribly. He didn't even finish his second year. Then he comes back to Denver. He's the quarterback's coach for 2 years, the offensive coordinator for 1 year. Then he leaves and goes to San Francisco and coaches their quarterbacks and is their offensive coordinator. And then in 1995, he comes back to Denver, and then they have their stretch together where they win a couple Super Bowls. And then Mike Shanahan had a lot of success as a head coach even after that. And so if the parallels in the stories are really interesting, as a guy that was the OC, leaves to be a head coach, fails, then comes back, and ultimately they have the success everyone's looking for. So I like that. And then, Brian Daboll's been part of 5 Super Bowl winning teams and 1 college football national championship. He's been around Belichick. He's been around Saban. I think that's good. What are the concerns with Brian Daboll? Well, the Giants' tenure, it didn't go well. They were 20-40-1, and you just didn't see progress. They started off 9-7-1, backdoor into the playoffs. Daboll's the coach of the year. They win a lot of games that just kind of fluky, didn't feel sustainable, and then they lean into the success that they had and really didn't stay committed to their vision, and things kind of got off the rails, and you just didn't get progress. They got worse. And I think that Brian Daboll is responsible for a lot of that. I worry a lot about his temperament. I think he's a bit of a hothead, right? I mean, some really animated moments on the sideline, and I think there's some value in being an even-keeled person, a steady presence. I worry about, just his temperament in general. The whole Jackson Dart thing and going back into the tent, like there's some goofy moments for sure that are very concerning. And then there's the defensive coordinator piece. Now, look, I don't think it's impossible for Brian Daboll to find the right defensive coordinator, right? And this will be a conversation we'll have about pretty much every offensive coach. But here's where I get a little concerned about Brian Daboll, is that in New York with the Giants, he had the opportunity to hire 2 defensive coordinators, and it really didn't go well. He hired Wink Martindale initially, and I believe the reports that their relationship was a little bit sour. And then they bring in Shane Bowen, and Shane Bowen was a disaster. So he was kind of like 0 for 2 in defensive coordinator hires, and you think he's kind of a hothead, and then he has a kind of relationship issue with Wink Martindale. I definitely had a relationship issue at one point with Sean McDermott, and there's plenty of things to be concerned about. There's plenty of things to like about Brian Daboll. So he's an interesting candidate for sure. If they hire him, I'd cling to everything I said in the appeal, and if they don't, I'll say, yeah, you know what, those concerns were real. But he's interesting for sure. Another guy that's interesting is Grant Udinski. 30 years old. He's a native of Doylestown, Pennsylvania, played tight end at Davidson, and then he transferred to Towson and played defensive end. He was a graduate assistant at Baylor in 2019, and he lived out of his car in a Walmart parking lot and coached under Matt Rule. And he followed Matt Rule to the Carolina Panthers, where he was a coaching assistant from 2020 through 2021. Then he went to the Vikings in 2022 as an assistant to the head coach in special projects, where he provided advanced scouting for Kevin O'Connell and helped with some practice functions. And Kevin O'Connell with the Vikings fell in love with him, promoted him to assistant quarterbacks coach, and then to assistant offensive coordinator. And then he goes to Jacksonville with Liam Cohen and is their offensive coordinator this past year. And so he's had a very quick glow up. And as we get into the appeal with Grant Udinski, I'm very curious about these types of coaches, where you might say 30 years old, not a ton of experience, but these guys that are just kind of like young and instantly pegged as guys that are going to be head coaches. There's something appealing about them. I mean, how do you not look at the Sean McVay story, the Matt LaFleur story, the Kyle Shanahan, Liam Cohen, Dave Canales? How do you not look at all of that and say, you know what? I think I got to be open-minded to this type of guy. And so I like that he's this bright, celebrated, young offensive mind that 2 really good young offensive coaches in Kevin O'Connell and Liam Cohen have really spoken highly of. There's rave reviews. He's a grinder. He lived out of his car. Smart guy, had like a crazy good GPA in college. And I like the influences that he's had in Kevin O'Connell and Liam Cohen. And I even like that he was around Matt Rule in Carolina. That was a pretty disastrous situation, but being exposed to it, he probably got a chance to learn some things and see some things that'll make him better for his career. So I think there's plenty to be intrigued with as it relates to Grant Udinski. Now, there's concerns as well. I mean, he's young. If the Bills or whatever team were to hire him this cycle, he'd be the youngest head coach in the history of the NFL. He has 6 years of experience in the NFL and never as a play caller. So is it fair to think to yourself, is he the right guy for this assignment? I like the idea of being bold and perhaps finding a star. I really do like that idea. But if you kind of assess him and get a chance to really meet him and feel like, you know what, just not quite ready, I'd understand it. But if you get him in the building and you start to talk to him and you think, oh my goodness, this guy has the makings of a McVay or a Shanahan or a Kevin O'Connell type coach, like I don't think you should be shy about following through on that intuition. All right, got more candidates to talk about here in the next block. We'll get to Anthony Weaver, Anthony Lynn, and Lou Anarumo. We'll do that next, folks. Be sure to stick with us. If you've ever hired someone who looked good on paper but wasn't the right fit, you know how important that is. When you want candidates who truly match what you're looking for, trust Indeed sponsored jobs. Hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed sponsored jobs puts your post at the top of the page and helps you reach the right candidates faster. If I need to hire someone, I'd go straight to Indeed and be very specific about what I need. Real experience, not just some resume buzzwords. And it'll give you the opportunity to spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results using Indeed sponsored jobs. And check it out. Listeners of this show get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, do it the right way with Indeed. Tax season doesn't have to take over your life. This year, TurboTax is making it easier than ever to hand things off and move on with your day. With TurboTax full service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert, start to finish, without the stress or game work. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They handle everything from W-2s to self-employed forms and work to get you every deduction. You can upload your documents, go about your day, and get updates right in the TurboTax app. It's a huge time saver and gives real peace of mind knowing an expert is handling it. For a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life. Visit TurboTax.com/local to book your appointment today. All right, let's get into these last three. Anthony Weaver, 45 years old, born in Texas, went to high school in Saratoga Springs, New York, was a good college football player at Notre Dame, second-round pick of the Ravens, played defensive end, had a 7-year career in the NFL, got into coaching in 2010, was a college assistant for 2 years. Then he was the Jets assistant defensive coordinator in 2012, the Bills defensive line coach in 2013, Browns defensive line coach 2014 and 2015, Texans defensive line coach in 2016 through 2019, and their defensive coordinator in 2020, Ravens D-line coach in 2021 through 2023, but was also the assistant head coach his last 2 years, and then he was the Dolphins defensive coordinator the last 2 years. So what's appealing about Anthony Weaver? I think quite a bit. I actually like Anthony Weaver a lot. He's a player coach. And so you think about this archetype of like Mike Vrabel, Dan Campbell, DeMeco Ryans, John Harbaugh, Kevin O'Connell, Kellen Moore. We'll see on Aaron Glenn, but there's definitely an uptick in these player coaches and it working out in the NFL. And I think Anthony Weaver has a chance to be kind of that next guy. I think he's done a great job with his opportunity in Miami the last 2 years. I think he's coached way above his talent. And he faced a ton of adversity with personnel, and they showed steady growth. Like last year in the season that just happened, for them to piece that defense together and have a ton of young guys playing in the secondary, young guys playing up front, and to see how it evolved throughout the course of the year was really outstanding. And then the year before that, like the entire safety room and linebacker room and edge room were just not what they were supposed to be, and he still kind of figured it out. I gained so much respect for him over what he did the last 2 years in Miami, because I think he showed his ability to really maximize what he had, despite being what I think was a pretty undermanned defensive talent pool. I think he's a guy that, from a leadership perspective, a strong presence. I think you'll love that. I think he'll coach the guys hard. I love his exposures as well and the connections that he should have. And like the things that he's been exposed to, not necessarily because they've been something that was good, but I think seeing some weird stuff as well is probably good, like Rex Ryan in Buffalo, like John Harbaugh, Bill O'Brien in Houston, saw that Mike Pettin year with the Browns, was around Mike McDaniel the last 2 years in Miami. The dude has seen some stuff, and I think that will make him better as his coaching career elongates, and somebody should make this man their head coach. What's the concern here? Well, he's defensive-minded, and you'll be concerned about nailing the offensive coordinator piece. You'd want to know the plan when you sat down with him. Like, what's your plan for the offense? And it's got to be one you like. And he's never been a head coach, so you have a lot of appeal here, but I think he misses the mark in terms of being offensive-minded. And while he is really experienced, he's never been a head coach, which will be true for a lot of these candidates. It's not necessarily a disqualifier for me. I think if you're looking for that strong leadership presence, CEO, can handle the defense, coach the guys hard, I think he'd work out. I'm not totally out on the idea of Anthony Weaver. I think he's got a lot of redeeming qualities. All right, let's talk about Anthony Lynn, 57 years old, a native of Texas, was an NFL running back 1992 through 1999 with the Giants, Broncos, and 49ers. Started his coaching career with the Broncos as a special teams assistant in 2000, held that job for 3 years. Then he was the Jags running backs coach, Cowboys running backs coach, Browns running backs coach, Jets running backs coach, where he was also the assistant head coach for his last 2 seasons. He follows Rex Ryan to Buffalo. He's the running backs coach in Buffalo and the assistant head coach, and then he replaced Greg Roman as the offensive coordinator after the Bills fired him. After his time in Buffalo, he went to be the Chargers head coach 2017 through 2020. It was the last 3 years of Phillip Rivers with the Chargers, and then the first year of Justin Herbert. They went 9-7, 12-4, 5-11, 7-9. 33 and 31 all time as a head coach with the Chargers. Then he went to be the Lions offensive coordinator in 2021, 49ers assistant head coach and running backs coach in 2022 through 23. And then he spent the last 2 years as the Commanders run game coordinator and running backs coach. So incredibly experienced. So what's the appeal here with Anthony Lynn? I think he's a very highly respected leader. He's incredibly experienced. He's been around. He will have no issues with connections and filling out a staff. And I think he probably fits that Ryan Fitzpatrick idea that I discussed when we talked about Brian Daboll as a guy that will come in and coach the guys hard. And, he's not going to try to be anybody's friend, but he'll work hard to really try to bring the most out of these guys. And he does fit that mold of a player's coach. I talked about it. Vrabel, Campbell, D'Amico Ryans, Harbaugh, Kevin O'Connell, Kellen Moore. He fits that as well. And he's been a head coach, right? He's been in that seat. And I'm not sure that it went particularly well or that it was overly impressive, but he has done it. He has 4 years of time as an NFL head coach. So what's the concern? Well, I guess you kind of point to his first run as a head coach. Last 3 years of Phillip Rivers, first year of Justin Herbert. And Justin Herbert's rookie season was really good. But, Shane Steichen was the offensive coordinator. Ken Wisenhunt was the offensive coordinator with Phillip Rivers. And so is he an offensive-minded coach that's still coordinator dependent on the offensive side of the football? That's concerning to me. That's like Nick Sirianni with the Eagles, where it's like, hey, you're offensive-minded, but you're also not like the guy for the play calling and scheme. It's unusual. And for as much respect as I believe Anthony Lynn has across the league, he hasn't really been a serious candidate in other spots. I mean, he was the Chargers head coach last in 2020, and I don't really feel like he's been a guy that other teams are interviewing and has been a candidate for other jobs. And so I know he was a finalist when the Bills hired McDermott, and maybe there's some, hey, just want to touch base and see where we're at. And, there was some appeal back then, and I think it was a different situation. Since then, a lot's happened. in Anthony Lynn's career. And so there's things that I would like about Anthony Lynn, but he's certainly not high on my list. And I just don't love the idea of an offensive mind that doesn't necessarily solve your scheme or play calling. That's unusual to me. The last candidate to talk about is Lou Anarumo, 59 years old, grew up in New York City, was a college assistant for a long time, 1989 through 2011 at Wagner, Syracuse, Harvard, Marshall, and Purdue. Then he becomes the Dolphins defensive backs coach in 2012, carries that job through 2017, was the Giants DBs coach in 2018, Bengals defensive coordinator 2019 through 2024. I think that's really where he made a lot of noise. Had that really outstanding run as the defensive coordinator in the playoffs the year that they went to the Super Bowl and lost to the Rams. I think we'll talk about that in a second. Then this past year, he was the Colts defensive coordinator. What's appealing about Lou Anarumo? I think he's a great defensive mind. I think he's one of the best game plan specific defensive coaches in the league. He had that awesome run with the Bengals that got them to the Super Bowl. It really wasn't Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow didn't do much during that playoff run. It was really great defensive schemes and play calls. I think he's got that stuff. Like I think he's got some of the Spags, Steve Spagnuolo ability as a defensive play caller, and he'll coach the guys hard. I have no doubt about that. The concern is that he's defensive minded, never been a head coach, and he's a guy that gives you the better coordinator than head coach vibe. And so I respect him so much as a defensive mind. I'm not super eager to find out what he's like as a head coach. He's made some interesting comments about young players in the past. He's definitely he's gonna rule with an iron fist type guy. And so some appeal, some concern, not over the moon about that one. So that's the initial list. I think we got to be open-minded. I think we have to realize the good and the concerns and see where it goes. And I think we'll have more candidates to talk about as well, especially Davis Webb and Clint Kubiak, who are two guys that I'm pretty high on as possibilities for this job. So hopefully this was helpful for you to get acquainted with the initial list, and obviously a ton more as it relates to discussing the possibilities for the next head coach of the Bills. So don't miss anything. Make sure that you're subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills, and I look forward to catching up with you again real soon.